The rain hammered against the windows of the Military Intelligence Office as Captain Sarah Mitchell sat across from her superior, Colonel Robert Hayes. The dim lighting cast long shadows across the maps and satellite images scattered on his desk. Sarah's hands remained steady despite the gravity of what she was about to hear. She had been called in at midnight, which meant something had gone terribly wrong. Colonel Hayes rubbed his tired eyes and leaned forward. His voice was low and measured, carrying the weight of desperate circumstances. General Thomas Brennan, one of the most decorated military strategists in the country, had been kidnapped 3 days ago while on a diplomatic mission in the volatile border region of Karathos. The kidnappers were a militant group known as the Red Scorpions, notorious for their ruthlessness and their complete disregard for international law. They had taken the general deep into enemy territory, far beyond the reach of conventional rescue operations. Sarah listened intently as the colonel explained that every attempt to locate the general had failed. Satellite surveillance was useless in the dense jungle terrain where the Red Scorpions operated. Drone reconnaissance had been shot down. The local government was either unable or unwilling to help. Diplomatic channels had yielded nothing but silence. The situation was growing more dire by the hour. Intelligence suggested the militants were planning to execute the general within the week as a show of power. The colonel paused and looked directly at Sarah. What he said next changed everything. The higher command had decided that a small, covert operation was the only option. But not just small. They wanted a solo operative. Someone who could move undetected through hostile territory, gather intelligence, locate the general, and extract him without triggering a firefight that could escalate into an international incident. Someone with the skills, the training, and the sheer determination to pull off what seemed impossible. Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly, but her expression remained calm. She had trained for years in special operations. Her record was impeccable. She spoke 4 languages fluently, including the local dialect of Karathos. She was an expert in survival tactics, close combat, and covert infiltration. But this was different from anything she had ever done. This was a mission with almost no chance of success, and even less chance of survival if things went wrong. The colonel slid a folder across the desk. Inside were photographs of General Brennan, maps of the region, and intelligence reports on the Red Scorpions. Their leader was a man named Viktor Kozlov, a former military officer who had turned to terrorism after his country's civil war. He was smart, paranoid, and surrounded by loyal fighters who would die for him. The Red Scorpions operated from a network of camps hidden in the mountainous jungle, constantly moving to avoid detection. Sarah opened the folder and studied the materials carefully. The general's last known location was a village called Sarajevo, about 15 kilometers from the border. Intelligence suggested he had been moved deeper into the mountains shortly after his capture. The terrain was brutal, the weather unpredictable, and the entire region was crawling with hostile forces. Any mistake would be fatal. The colonel explained the plan, though calling it a plan was generous. Sarah would be dropped near the border under the cover of darkness. From there, she would be completely on her own. No backup, no extraction team on standby, no communication unless absolutely necessary. Radio silence was essential to avoid detection. She would have to rely entirely on her training and instincts. Her mission objectives were clear but daunting. First, infiltrate enemy territory without being detected. Second, locate General Brennan using whatever intelligence she could gather on the ground. Third, assess the situation and determine the best method of extraction. Fourth, free the general and get him to the extraction point. Fifth, survive. Sarah closed the folder and met the colonel's gaze. She understood what he was really asking. This mission had been deemed too dangerous for a full team. The risk of losing multiple operatives was too high. But one person, moving alone, might have a chance. It was a calculated gamble with her life as the stake. She also understood that refusing was not really an option. General Brennan had saved countless lives with his strategic brilliance. He was a national hero. Leaving him to die was unthinkable. She nodded once, accepting the mission. The colonel's expression showed both relief and regret. He knew he was sending her into a nightmare. He stood and shook her hand firmly. Then, told her she had 12 hours to prepare. At dawn, She would board a transport that would take her to the staging area. From there, a helicopter would drop her at the border. After that, she would be a ghost. Sarah left the office and walked through the empty corridors of the military base. Her mind was already shifting into mission mode, running through scenarios and contingencies. She went to the armory first, selecting her equipment with meticulous care. She chose a lightweight tactical vest, a suppressed pistol, a combat knife, and a compact rifle with a scope. She packed minimal supplies, water purification tablets, high-calorie rations, a first aid kit, and climbing gear. Every gram mattered when you were moving alone through hostile jungle. In her quarters, she laid out everything on her bed and checked each item twice. She studied the maps until she had memorized every ridge, every river, every village. She reviewed the intelligence reports, learning the patterns of Red Scorpion patrols, their typical hideout locations, and their methods of operation. She practiced her cover story in the local dialect, preparing herself to blend in if necessary. As the hours passed, Sarah allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought about her family, her friends, the life she might never return to. But she pushed those thoughts aside. Emotion was a luxury she could not afford. The mission required absolute focus, unwavering determination, and a willingness to do whatever it took to bring General Brennan home. At dawn, she reported to the airfield. The transport was waiting, its engines already running. Colonel Hayes was there to see her off. He handed her a small device, an emergency beacon that would transmit her location if activated. But using it would expose her position to everyone, friend and foe alike. It was truly a last resort. The flight was long and tense. Sarah sat alone in the cargo hold, reviewing her mental checklist over and over. The pilot gave her a 30-minute warning as they approached the staging area. She gathered her gear and prepared for the helicopter transfer. The staging area was a small forward operating base, barely more than a few tents, and a landing pad carved out of the jungle. The helicopter pilot was a veteran, his face weathered by years of dangerous missions. He did not ask questions, just gave her a brief nod as she climbed aboard. They lifted off immediately, flying low to avoid radar detection. The landscape below transformed from open plains to dense jungle to steep mountains. The helicopter hugged the terrain, weaving between peaks as they approached the border. The pilot turned and pointed ahead. They were 5 minutes from the drop point. Sarah checked her gear one final time, ensuring everything was secure. The helicopter descended into a small clearing surrounded by thick vegetation. Before the skids even touched the ground, Sarah jumped out and moved quickly into the tree line. The helicopter was gone in seconds, the sound of its rotors fading into the distance. Silence enveloped her. She was alone in enemy territory. The mission had begun. Sarah crouched in the underbrush, listening to the sounds of the jungle. Birds, insects, the distant rush of water. No human voices, no engines, no signs of immediate danger. She consulted her compass and began moving northeast, toward the last known location of General Brennan. The terrain was exactly as brutal as the report suggested. Dense vegetation grabbed at her clothing, steep slopes tested her endurance, and the humidity was oppressive. She moved carefully, placing each step with deliberation. Speed was important, but stealth was essential. The Red Scorpions had patrols throughout this region, and local villagers might report suspicious activity for money or out of fear. Sarah had to become invisible, a shadow passing through the jungle without leaving a trace. Hours passed as she navigated through the wilderness. She crossed streams by stepping on rocks to avoid leaving footprints in the mud. She avoided obvious trails, knowing they would be watched or booby-trapped. When she heard voices in the distance, she froze and waited, sometimes for 30 minutes or more, until she was certain the area was clear. As night fell, Sarah found a defensible position on a rocky outcrop overlooking a valley. She could see the lights of a village in the distance, probably Sarajevo. She ate a small portion of rations and drank sparingly from her water supply. Sleep was necessary, but dangerous. She set up a simple perimeter alert system using thin cord and small bells from her kit, then allowed herself 2 hours of light rest, her mind trained to wake at the slightest unusual sound. When dawn broke, she was already moving again. She approached Sarajevo cautiously, using binoculars to observe from a distance. The village was small, maybe 50 buildings clustered around a central square. She noticed Red Scorpion fighters patrolling the area, their distinctive red armbands visible even from her position. This confirmed the intelligence reports. The militants had a presence here. Sarah needed information. She could not simply storm through the jungle hoping to stumble upon the general. She needed to know where the Red Scorpions were keeping him, how many guards he had, and what the surrounding terrain looked like. That meant getting closer, which meant taking enormous risks. She waited until midday when the heat was at its peak, and activity in the village slowed. She changed into civilian clothing from her pack, hiding her tactical gear in the brush. She tied a scarf around her head and smudged dirt on her face to alter her appearance. With her language skills and her ability to blend in, she would pose as a local woman traveling to visit family. Sarah entered the village from the east, walking with the tired gait of someone who had been traveling all morning. She kept her eyes down, respectful and unassuming. A few people glanced at her, but no one challenged her. She moved toward the market area, where she could observe and listen without drawing attention. At a small stall selling bread, she struck up a conversation with an elderly woman. She asked innocent questions about the village, the weather, the crops. Then, carefully, she mentioned seeing soldiers on the road and asked if it was safe to travel. The woman's expression darkened. She spoke in hushed tones about the Red Scorpions, how they had taken over parts of the region, how they brought only trouble. Sarah listened carefully, encouraging the woman to continue. The elderly vendor mentioned that the militants had brought an important prisoner through Sarajevo 3 days ago. A foreign man, well-dressed, clearly someone of importance. They had taken him up into the mountains, to the old fortress. The woman pointed vaguely toward the northeast, toward a mountain range shrouded in mist. Sarah thanked the woman and bought some bread, then moved away before attracting more attention. The old fortress. That was new information, not in any of the intelligence reports. It made sense, though. A fortress would be defensible, isolated, perfect for holding a high-value prisoner. She left the village as carefully as she had entered. Retrieving her hay, Sarah spent the entire night watching the fortress through her scope, her body motionless despite the cold mountain air that seeped through her clothing. She documented everything in her mind, creating a detailed mental map of the compound. The guard rotations changed every 4 hours, with the night shift appearing more relaxed and less attentive than their daytime counterparts. She counted exactly 23 fighters during the overnight hours, though she knew more would be sleeping inside the main structures. The fortress had been built strategically on a natural plateau, with sheer cliffs protecting 2 sides and thick stone walls securing the others. The main gate was the obvious entry point, but also the most heavily defended. Sarah noted a smaller service entrance on the western wall, used primarily for waste disposal and supply deliveries. This gate saw less traffic and fewer guards, making it a potential vulnerability. As dawn approached, activity within the fortress increased. Fighters emerged from the barracks, smoke rose from cooking fires, and patrols prepared to head out into the surrounding area. Sarah remained perfectly still, controlling her breathing and ignoring the cramping in her legs. Movement would give away her position, and discovery at this stage would doom the entire mission. Around 7 in the morning, something significant happened. A door in the central keep opened, and 2 guards emerged, escorting a man between them. Even from a distance, Sarah recognized General Brennan from his photographs. He was alive, though he appeared haggard and moved with difficulty. The guards led him across the courtyard to a smaller building, likely for interrogation or simply to move him to a different holding area. Sarah's pulse quickened. Now she knew exactly where he was being kept. She watched as the general was taken into the smaller building, and the guards posted themselves outside the door. 2 guards, rotating every 4 hours based on the pattern she had observed. The building had 1 visible entrance and small windows set high in the walls, probably to prevent escape attempts. The structure was positioned near the eastern wall of the fortress, which meant it was relatively close to the cliff edge on that side. Sarah began formulating a plan. A frontal assault was impossible. Even with her skills, she could not take on 23 trained fighters, and the fortress layout provided defenders with every advantage. Stealth was the only option, which meant entering at night and moving through the compound without being detected. The service entrance seemed like her best bet for infiltration. But getting in was only part of the problem. She also had to reach the building where the general was held, neutralize the guards silently, free him, and then escape with a man who was likely injured or weakened from days of captivity. And they would have to do all of this while dozens of armed militants slept mere meters away. The margin for error was non-existent. Sarah spent the entire day watching and refining her plan. She studied the patrol routes, noting that there was a brief window around 3 in the morning when the guard change created a gap in coverage near the service entrance. She observed that the guards outside the general's building often sat rather than stood during the late-night hours, suggesting fatigue and reduced alertness. She also noticed that the eastern section of the fortress, near the cliff, had fewer fighters because the natural barrier made that area seem secure. As the second night fell, Sarah prepared herself mentally and physically. She ate a full ration, knowing she would need all her strength. She checked her weapons, ensuring her knife was razor-sharp and her pistol suppressor was properly attached. She rehearsed every movement in her mind, visualizing each step of the infiltration. At midnight, she began her approach. Moving in complete darkness, she descended from her observation post and circled around to the western side of the fortress. The terrain here was treacherous, loose rocks, and steep drop-offs that required absolute concentration. One misstep would send rocks tumbling down the mountainside, alerting every guard in the fortress. It took her nearly 2 hours to reach the base of the western wall near the service entrance. She could hear voices above her, guards talking in low tones. She pressed herself against the cold stone and waited, counting the minutes until the guard change. At precisely 3:15, she heard footsteps as the night guards moved toward the main gate to be relieved by the next shift. This was her moment. Sarah scaled the wall using climbing gear, moving with practiced efficiency. The stone was old and offered plenty of handholds, but it was also crumbling in places, requiring her to test each grip carefully. She reached the top of the wall and peered over. The courtyard was empty, the guards all focused on the changing of shifts at the main gate. She dropped silently into the compound, landing in a crouch near a stack of supply crates. Her heart pounded, but her breathing remained controlled. She was inside. Now came the truly dangerous part. Sarah moved through the shadows, using every bit of cover available. She passed within meters of sleeping fighters, the sounds of their snoring drifting through open windows. She avoided the main pathways, instead threading between buildings and staying close to walls where the darkness was deepest. The journey across the compound took 20 agonizing minutes. Several times she had to freeze in place as a guard passed nearby or a door opened unexpectedly. Each time, she remained motionless, trusting the darkness and her training to keep her invisible. Her military instructors had drilled into her that patience was often the difference between success and failure in covert operations. Rush, and you die. Finally, she reached the building where General Brennan was being held. The 2 guards outside were exactly as she had observed, sitting on stools and leaning against the wall, their rifles resting across their laps. One appeared to be dozing while the other stared blankly into the darkness, clearly fighting to stay awake. Sarah approached from behind, moving with the silence of a predator. She had to take both guards down simultaneously and silently. Any sound would bring the entire fortress down on her. She drew her knife and her pistol, calculating angles and distances. She would need to be perfect. She struck with brutal efficiency. Her knife took the first guard in the throat before he could react, while her suppressed pistol delivered a headshot to the second guard with barely a whisper of sound. Both men slumped without making a noise. Sarah caught them and lowered them carefully to the ground, then dragged their bodies into the shadows beside the building. Her hands were steady despite what she had just done. She had been trained to compartmentalize, to separate the necessary violence of her mission from her personal feelings. There would be time for reflection later, if she survived. Right now, she had to keep moving. The door to the building was locked, but the lock was old and simple. Sarah used her picks and had it open in less than a minute. She slipped inside, closing the door silently behind her. The interior was dark and smelled of mold and unwashed bodies. She moved forward carefully, her pistol ready. A voice spoke from the darkness, weak but defiant. General Brennan had heard someone enter and assumed it was another interrogator. Sarah whispered his name and identified herself as United States military. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then, the general responded, his voice filled with disbelief and hope. She found him in a small cell, his hands bound, and his face bruised from beatings. Sarah cut his bonds and helped him to his feet. He was weaker than she had hoped, clearly dehydrated and suffering from his ordeal. She gave him water from her canteen and a quick medical assessment. No broken bones, but he would need support to move quickly. The general asked how many soldiers had come for him. When Sarah told him she was alone, his expression showed both admiration and concern. He understood immediately how desperate the situation was. They had to escape from a fortress full of armed enemies with no backup and no margin for error. Sarah explained her plan quickly. They would exit through the eastern section of the fortress and use climbing gear to descend the cliff face. It was dangerous, especially with the general in his weakened state, but it was their only option. The cliffs were sheer and treacherous, which was precisely why the Red Scorpions did not guard them heavily. No one would expect an escape attempt in that direction. She gave the general a brief overview of the compound layout and their route to the cliff. He nodded, focusing despite his exhaustion. He had been a soldier long before he became a general, and his training was coming back to him. Sarah helped him into a guard's jacket and cap that she had taken from one of the men outside, a basic disguise that might buy them precious seconds if they were spotted at a distance. They left the building together, Sarah supporting the general with one arm while her other hand held her pistol ready. They moved slowly, the general's condition preventing them from moving as quickly as Sarah would have liked. Every step felt exposed. Every shadow seemed to hide an enemy fighter. They were halfway across the compound when their luck ran out. A guard emerged from a building directly in their path, stretching and yawning. He looked up and saw them. For a frozen moment, everyone was still. Then, the guard's eyes widened as he realized something was wrong, his hand moving toward his rifle. Sarah fired first, her suppressed pistol making only a soft cough as the bullet struck the guard in the chest. He fell backward through the doorway he had just exited. But the damage was done. From inside the building, voices called out in alarm. Someone had heard the guard fall. Sarah grabbed the general and ran. Stealth was no longer an option. Their only chance now was speed. They sprinted toward the eastern wall as shouts erupted behind them. Lights came on throughout the fortress. The alarm had been raised. Gunfire erupted, bullets striking the stone walls around them and kicking up dirt at their feet. Sarah returned fire, forcing their pursuers to take cover and buying precious seconds. The general ran beside her, pushing through his pain and exhaustion with sheer willpower. They reached the eastern wall, and Sarah pulled out her climbing gear. The cliff was a black void in the darkness, a sheer drop of over 100 meters to the rocky valley below. Sarah attached a rope to a metal ring embedded in the wall, likely an old anchor point from when the fortress was actively used. She clipped the general into a harness with practiced speed, then attached herself to the same rope. Red Scorpion fighters appeared on the wall above them, muzzle flashes lighting up the night as they fired down. Sarah pushed the general over the edge and followed immediately, rappelling down the cliff face with controlled drops. Bullets struck the rock face around them, sending stone chips flying. One round grazed Sarah's shoulder, a line of fire that she forced herself to ignore. They descended rapidly, using a technique that was barely controlled falling. The general's inexperience with this type of descent showed, but Sarah guided him, calling out instructions and controlling their speed with the rope. Above them, the Red Scorpions continued firing, and she could hear them organizing to pursue. Halfway down the cliff, the rope jerked violently. Sarah looked up and saw one of the fighters sawing at their line with a knife. In seconds, the rope would be cut, and they would fall to their deaths. She made a split-second decision, spotting a narrow ledge about 10 meters below them. She kicked off from the cliff face, swinging them both toward the ledge just as the rope parted. The descent down the cliff face tested every ounce of Sarah's strength and determination. The general's hands were shaking from exhaustion and fear, his fingers struggling to maintain their grip on the cold rock. Sarah talked him through each movement with calm, measured instructions, never showing the panic she felt inside. One wrong move, one slipped handhold, and they would both plummet to the rocks below. Above them, the sounds from the fortress changed. The red scorpions had realized their mistake. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, searching the cliff face. Shouts echoed off the stone walls as fighters organized search parties. It would not be long before they found the ledge where Sarah and the general had landed and realized their prisoners were still alive and climbing down. Sarah pushed herself harder, finding handholds in the darkness more by touch than sight. Her training had included rock climbing, but nothing like this. Nothing in the dead of night, with an injured man depending on her, while enemies searched for them from above. Sweat stung her eyes despite the cold mountain air. Her wounded shoulder screamed with pain every time she pulled herself downward. The general was struggling. His breathing came in ragged gasps, and his movements were becoming less coordinated. Sarah could tell he was reaching the end of his physical reserves. She called up to him softly, encouraging him, telling him they were almost there even though they still had 30 meters to go. Sometimes a lie was kinder than the truth. A shout from above made Sarah's blood run cold. They had been spotted. Gunfire erupted again, bullets striking the cliff face around them with sharp cracks. Rock fragments exploded outward, several pieces hitting Sarah in the face and arms. She pressed herself against the cliff, trying to use the natural contours of the rock for cover while simultaneously guiding the general to do the same. The angle of the cliff actually worked in their favor. The red scorpions could not get a clear shot without leaning far over the edge, and in the darkness their aim was poor. But it only took one lucky bullet to end the mission. Sarah knew they had to keep moving, even under fire. Staying still meant death. She urged the general downward, moving as quickly as safety allowed. Her hands were bleeding freely now, the rough rock shredding her skin despite her gloves. She could feel warm blood making her grip slippery, forcing her to wipe her palms on her pants between movements. The general was in similar condition, his inexperience making his descent even more damaging to his hands. 20 meters from the bottom, disaster struck. The general's foot slipped, and his entire weight suddenly shifted. He scrabbled desperately at the rock face, his fingers finding nothing but smooth stone. He fell, his body sliding down the cliff. Sarah reacted instantly, reaching out and grabbing his jacket with one hand while her other hand and both feet desperately sought purchase. For a terrifying moment, she thought they would both fall. The general's full weight pulled at her arm, threatening to tear her from the cliff. Her fingers screamed in agony as she gripped a small outcropping with her free hand. Her feet found a narrow crack, and she jammed them in, ignoring the pain. She held on with everything she had, muscles burning, vision tunneling from the strain. The general was hanging in space, his feet kicking uselessly, entirely dependent on Sarah's grip. She could not hold him like this for long. Using strength she did not know she possessed, Sarah slowly pulled the general back toward the cliff face. Her shoulder felt like it was tearing apart. Her grip on the rock began to slip. But, inch by agonizing inch, she pulled him closer until his hands could grasp the rock again. They both clung to the cliff face, breathing hard, too exhausted to speak. Sarah's entire body was shaking from the effort. But they could not rest. The red scorpions above were still shooting, and she could see flashlights beginning to descend from the fortress. A pursuit team was coming down after them, likely using proper climbing equipment and moving much faster. Sarah forced herself to keep moving. 15 meters. 10 meters. The ground was close now, close enough that a fall might be survivable, though certainly not pleasant. The general was moving on pure instinct at this point, his body simply following Sarah's instructions without conscious thought. She could hear him mumbling to himself, perhaps prayers, or perhaps just meaningless words to keep himself focused. When Sarah's feet finally touched solid ground, she nearly collapsed from relief. The general landed beside her moments later and did collapse, falling to his knees on the rocky valley floor. Sarah wanted nothing more than to lie down and rest, but they were far from safe. The pursuit team was still coming down the cliff, and she could see their lights getting closer. She hauled the general to his feet and got them moving. The valley floor was treacherous in the darkness, covered with loose rocks and hidden holes. Sarah supported the general as they stumbled forward, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the cliff. Behind them, the first Red Scorpion fighters reached the ground and immediately began tracking them. Sarah headed southwest, toward a forested area she had marked on her mental map during her initial reconnaissance. If they could reach the tree line, they would have a chance to lose their pursuers in the dense vegetation. But it was at least 2 kilometers away, and the general was barely able to walk. She was essentially dragging him, his arm over her shoulders, his feet stumbling more than running. Gunfire erupted from behind them. The Red Scorpions had spotted them in the darkness. Bullets whined past, close enough that Sarah could feel the air displacement. She pushed the general down behind a large boulder and returned fire with her rifle, forcing their pursuers to take cover. The muzzle flashes from her weapon gave away their position, but it also bought them precious seconds. She reloaded and fired again, placing her shots carefully to make the Red Scorpions think twice about rushing forward. Then, she grabbed the general and ran again, using the temporary suppression to gain distance. Her tactical training had taught her the principles of fire and movement. Keep the enemy's heads down, move to better position, repeat. It was textbook infantry tactics, but it worked. They reached a dry riverbed, and Sarah used it for cover, running along the depression in the ground while bullets cracked overhead. The general was gasping for breath, his legs giving out every few steps. Sarah knew he could not keep this pace much longer. She needed to find a defensible position where she could hold off their pursuers while the general rested. Ahead, she spotted what she needed. A cluster of large rocks and fallen trees created a natural fortification. It was not perfect, but it would have to do. She got the general behind cover and quickly assessed their tactical situation. She had maybe 50 rounds left for her rifle and 1 full magazine for her pistol, against at least 6 pursuers, possibly more. The math was not in their favor. The Red Scorpions were closing in, moving cautiously now that they knew their quarry was armed and dangerous. Sarah could see their flashlights bobbing in the darkness, spreading out to flank her position. They were well-trained fighters, not amateurs. They were using proper small unit tactics, which made them far more dangerous. Sarah made a hard decision. She could not win a sustained firefight against superior numbers, but she might be able to slow them down enough to escape. She pulled out one of her 2 remaining grenades, a fragmentation grenade she had hoped not to use. Grenades made noise, and noise brought more enemies. But, right now, she needed the chaos and fear that explosions created. She waited until the Red Scorpions were in range, bunched together as they approached what they thought was her position. Then, she pulled the pin and threw the grenade in a high arc. It landed perfectly in the middle of the approaching fighters. She pulled the general down and covered him with her body. The explosion lit up the night, a brilliant flash followed by the sharp crack of detonation. Screams followed, then confusion as the surviving fighters scattered for cover. Sarah was up instantly, firing controlled bursts at the disorganized enemies, then grabbing the general and running while they were still reeling from the blast. She made it to the tree line, plunging into the forest with the general stumbling beside her. Behind them, angry shouts and return fire, but the thick vegetation absorbed most of the bullets. Sarah weaved between trees, using the darkness and her training to navigate while the Red Scorpions crashed through the undergrowth behind them, their flashlights giving away their positions. The forest provided the cover Sarah needed. She led the general deeper into the vegetation, using every trick she knew to throw off their pursuers. She crossed and recrossed a small stream to break their scent trail. She led them over rocky ground to avoid leaving footprints. She doubled back on their path twice, creating false trails. After an hour of this, the sounds of pursuit faded. The Red Scorpions had either lost the trail or decided the chase was not worth it in the darkness of an unfamiliar forest. Sarah allowed herself and the general to rest, finding a hollow beneath the roots of a massive tree. They crawled inside the natural shelter, completely hidden from view. The general immediately collapsed into exhausted sleep. Sarah stayed awake, her rifle ready, listening to the forest sounds for any indication that enemies were near. Every crack of a branch, Every rustle of leaves made her grip her weapon tighter. But, gradually, the normal sounds of the forest returned, suggesting they were alone. As dawn approached, Sarah allowed herself to relax slightly. They had survived the night, escaped the fortress, and evaded immediate pursuit. But they were far from safe. They were still deep in enemy territory, the general was injured and exhausted, and the Red Scorpions would be organizing a massive search operation once daylight came. Sarah pulled out her map and studied it in the growing light. They were approximately 15 kilometers from the border and the extraction point. 15 kilometers of hostile territory, probably crawling with angry militants who now knew exactly what she looked like, and that she was protecting an American general. Every village, every road, every path would be watched. She planned their route carefully, avoiding all settlements and major trails. They would stick to the densest forest and roughest terrain, places where the Red Scorpions would be less likely to search thoroughly. It would be slow and difficult, especially with the general in his condition, but it was their best chance. When the general woke a few hours later, Sarah had already scouted their immediate area and prepared what breakfast she could from her remaining rations. The general looked worse in daylight. His face was covered in bruises and cuts. His hands were badly torn from the cliff climb, and he moved like a man decades older than his actual age. But his eyes were clear and determined. He asked about their situation, and Sarah gave him the truth. They had maybe a day and a half of hard travel to reach the border. They had minimal food and water. The enemy was searching for them. Their chances of making it were not good, but they were better than the chances had been when she first infiltrated the fortress. The general managed a weak smile at that. They moved out, Sarah leading, and the general following as best he could. The forest was thick and the terrain challenging, but at least they had cover. Sarah set a pace that pushed them but did not break the general completely. They needed to cover ground, but arriving at the extraction point so exhausted they could not defend themselves would be pointless. Throughout the day, they heard helicopters in the distance. The Red Scorpions were using aircraft to search for them, which complicated things considerably. Sarah kept them under the thickest canopy whenever possible, knowing that thermal imaging from helicopters could spot them even through light vegetation. Several times they had to freeze in place and wait while a helicopter passed overhead, its rotors beating the air like mechanical thunder. Around midday, they encountered a problem. A river, swollen from recent rains, blocked their path. It was too wide and fast to cross safely, especially with the general's weakened condition. Sarah scouted up and down the riverbank, looking for a better crossing point. She finally found a fallen tree that bridged the river about half a kilometer upstream. The tree was slippery and treacherous, barely wide enough for them to cross single file. Sarah went first, testing each step to ensure the bark would hold. Halfway across, she heard engines. Vehicles approaching on a nearby road, heading toward their position. She called back to the general to hurry, then moved as quickly as she dared across the remaining length of the fallen tree. The general started across just as the vehicles came into view through the trees. Red Scorpion trucks, at least 3 of them, packed with fighters. They had not seen Sarah and the general yet, but they were setting up a checkpoint on the bridge downstream, clearly intending to watch the river crossings. Sarah urged the general forward, knowing they had only seconds before someone looked in their direction. The general was moving too slowly, his exhausted body refusing to cooperate. The general threw himself forward with desperate energy, his survival instincts overriding his exhaustion. Bullets splintered the tree bark around his hands and feet, sending wooden shrapnel flying. One round passed so close to his head that he felt the heat of it. Sarah continued firing, forcing the Red Scorpions to stay behind cover rather than taking careful aim. She emptied her magazine, dropped it, and slammed in a fresh one with practiced speed. The general reached the riverbank and tumbled off the tree trunk, landing hard on the muddy ground beside Sarah. She grabbed his collar and hauled him behind a large boulder, just as concentrated fire tore through the space they had occupied a moment before. The Red Scorpions had recovered from their initial surprise and were now laying down heavy fire, using their superior numbers to suppress Sarah's position. Sarah assessed their situation quickly. They were pinned down with a river at their backs and enemies in front. The Red Scorpions would try to flank them, sending fighters upstream and downstream to cross the river and surround them. She had maybe 3 minutes before that happened. They needed to move now. She fired several rounds to keep the enemies' heads down, then pulled the general to his feet. They ran along the riverbank, using the terrain for cover. Behind them, the Red Scorpions surged forward, emboldened by their quarry's retreat. Sarah heard vehicle engines roaring to life as the trucks began pursuing along the road that paralleled the river. The forest thickened ahead, offering better concealment. Sarah pushed toward it, half carrying the general whose legs were giving out again from the latest burst of adrenaline-fueled exertion. They crashed through underbrush and over fallen logs, speed more important than stealth now. The Red Scorpions were close behind, their shouts and gunfire echoing through the trees. Sarah spotted a steep ravine cutting through the forest. Without hesitation, she led them toward it. The sides were nearly vertical, covered in loose dirt and exposed roots. She slid down first, controlling her descent by grabbing at vegetation, then caught the general as he tumbled down after her. They landed in a narrow stream at the bottom, the cold water shocking them both. The ravine was only about 4 feet wide, but at least 20 feet deep. The Red Scorpions would have a hard time seeing them down here, and even harder time getting down to pursue without exposing themselves. Sarah led the general downstream, sloshing through the ankle-deep water. The ravine twisted and turned, and she prayed it would lead them away from their pursuers rather than into a dead end. They moved as quickly as the slippery rocks and flowing water allowed. Behind them, Sarah could hear the Red Scorpions arguing about whether to follow into the ravine or continue searching above. She used the time to put distance between them, pushing the general forward even as he stumbled and nearly fell several times. After half a kilometer, the ravine opened up into a wider valley. Sarah climbed out cautiously, checking for enemies before helping the general up. They were in a different part of the forest now, and the sounds of pursuit had faded. But Sarah knew it was only temporary. The Red Scorpions would be calling in more resources, expanding their search pattern, and setting up checkpoints on every route toward the border. She checked her map again, trying to determine their exact location. The detour to cross the river and the chase through the forest had taken them off course. They were now farther from the extraction point than before, and the general was reaching the absolute limit of his endurance. His face was gray with exhaustion, his breathing labored, and he could barely stand without support. Sarah made the difficult decision to stop and rest. Pushing forward while the general was this depleted would only slow them down and potentially cause him to collapse entirely. She found a well-concealed spot beneath a rocky overhang, surrounded by thick brush. They could rest here for a few hours while she planned their next move. She tended to the general's injuries as best she could with her limited medical supplies. His hands were badly torn from the cliff climb, and she wrapped them in bandages after cleaning them with antiseptic. He had several deep bruises and cuts on his face and arms, likely from beatings during his captivity. But nothing appeared to be broken or life-threatening. The biggest issue was exhaustion and dehydration. Sarah gave him the last of her water and most of her remaining food. She would need her strength too, but the general was in far worse shape. He protested weakly, but she insisted. Getting him to the extraction point alive was the entire point of the mission. Her own comfort was irrelevant. While the general slept, Sarah scouted their immediate area. She found a small stream and refilled their water bottles, using purification tablets to make it safe to drink. She also found some edible plants and roots that could supplement their dwindling food supplies. It was not much, but it might keep them going for another day. She also took stock of her ammunition situation. She had 2 magazines left for her rifle, maybe 30 rounds total. 1 magazine for her pistol, 1 grenade. If they got into another sustained firefight, she would run out of ammunition long before she ran out of enemies. She would have to be even more selective about when to engage and when to evade. As afternoon turned to evening, Sarah woke the general. They needed to move under cover of darkness. The Red Scorpions would have night vision equipment, but Sarah was trained to operate in darkness and could use it to her advantage. She explained the plan to the general. They would move through the night, covering as much ground as possible before dawn. Then, they would hide during the day when helicopter searches would be most effective. The general nodded his understanding. He looked better after the rest, though still far from healthy. Sarah helped him to his feet, and they set out, moving slowly but steadily through the darkening forest. She navigated by compass and by the stars when they were visible through the canopy, trusting her training and instincts. They had been moving for about 2 hours when Sarah sensed something was wrong. The forest had gone quiet. No insects, no birds, no animal sounds. Just silence. Every tactical fiber in her being screamed danger. She signaled the general to stop and get down. Moments later, she heard them. Voices speaking in hushed tones, the metallic click of weapons being readied. An ambush. The Red Scorpions had somehow gotten ahead of them and set up an ambush along the route Sarah had planned to take. She must have been predictable, or perhaps they had simply guessed correctly about her destination and positioned themselves accordingly. Sarah slowly backed away, guiding the general with her. They moved with agonizing care, placing each foot carefully to avoid making noise. The ambush was well positioned, covering the obvious path through this part of the forest. If Sarah had continued on her planned route, they would have walked right into it. She led them on a wide detour, adding hours to their journey, but avoiding what would have been a fatal encounter. The general followed without complaint, though she could tell each step was becoming harder for him. His determination was remarkable, but determination alone could not overcome the physical toll his body had endured. Around midnight, they stopped to rest again. Sarah allowed the general to sleep while she kept watch, her rifle ready, her senses straining to detect any threat in the darkness. The night was cold, and she could see her breath misting in the air. Neither of them had adequate cold weather gear, and hypothermia was becoming a real concern as they gained altitude, moving toward the mountain pass that would lead them to the border. At dawn, they were on the move again. Sarah's exhaustion was catching up with her now. She had barely slept in 3 days, operating on adrenaline and willpower. Her wounded shoulder throbbed with every movement, and her hands were torn and bleeding from the cliff climb. But she pushed forward, knowing that stopping meant capture or death. The terrain was becoming more mountainous as they approached the border region. The forest thinned out, replaced by rocky slopes and sparse vegetation. This made concealment harder, but also meant they could see their surroundings better. Sarah could spot the border mountains in the distance, maybe 10 kilometers away. So close, yet still so far. They came across a small mountain village around mid-morning. Sarah observed it from a distance, trying to decide whether to go around or risk passing through. Going around would add several hours to their journey, but going through risked being recognized or reported. She was deciding when the decision was made for her. A patrol of Red Scorpion fighters emerged from the village, heading directly toward their position. They had been spotted, probably by a villager who then reported them to the militants. Sarah cursed under her breath and looked for escape routes. The terrain here was relatively open, offering few places to hide. She made a split-second tactical decision. Instead of running, which would definitely attract attention and start a chase they could not win, she and the general would hide in plain sight. She quickly pulled out the civilian clothing she had carried with her and had the general put it on over his torn military uniform. She did the same, transforming from soldier to civilian in moments. When the patrol approached, Sarah and the general were sitting beside the path, looking for all the world like two travelers resting. Sarah had torn her clothing further and smudged dirt on both their faces to make them look like poor locals. The general kept his head down, pretending to be asleep or sick. The Red Scorpion fighters approached with weapons ready. Their leader, a scarred man with cold eyes, demanded to know who they were and where they were going. Sarah responded in the local dialect, explaining they were traveling to the next village to visit family. Her sick father, she said, gesturing to the general, needed to see a doctor there. The leader studied them suspiciously. Sarah kept her expression neutral, hiding the terror she felt. Under her civilian clothes, her pistol was tucked into her waistband, ready to draw if needed. But if shooting started at this range, with this many enemies, they would die. Her only chance was to sell the deception. The fighters seemed unconvinced. One of them stepped closer to the general, trying to get a better look at his face. Sarah's hand moved imperceptibly toward her concealed weapon, preparing for what seemed inevitable. The general groaned and coughed, maintaining his sick act perfectly despite the danger. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the younger fighters spoke up, saying they were wasting time on obviously poor villagers when they should be searching for the American soldier and her prisoner. The escaped prisoners would never be foolish enough to sit openly beside a path. The scarred leader seemed to consider this, then nodded. He warned Sarah and the general to get off the mountain before dark, as it was dangerous, then led his patrol away. Sarah waited until they were out of sight before allowing Sarah positioned the general in a concealed spot overlooking the valley that led to the extraction point. She pointed out the route he should take once she started her diversion, a path that used the natural terrain to provide maximum cover. The general gripped her hand firmly, his eyes showing gratitude and concern. He told her that what she had done, coming alone to rescue him, was the most courageous act he had witnessed in 40 years of military service. Sarah simply nodded, uncomfortable with praise when the mission was not yet complete. She moved away from the general's position, working her way along the ridge to a spot about half a kilometer distant. From here, she had a clear view of 2 Red Scorpion checkpoints, and could fire on both before they could effectively respond. The positions were well placed to guard the border, but their very positioning meant the militants were spread out, unable to quickly support each other. Sarah checked her remaining ammunition one final time. 28 rounds for her rifle, 15 for her pistol, 1 grenade. Not much for what she was about to do, but it would have to be enough. She laid out the magazines within easy reach and found a firing position that gave her both good visibility and a covered retreat route. The rocks here formed a natural fortification, and a narrow crevice behind her position led down the backside of the ridge. She took several deep breaths, calming her mind and steadying her hands. Everything she had trained for, everything she had endured over the past few days, came down to the next few minutes. She had to create enough chaos to pull the Red Scorpions away from the general's crossing point, but not get herself killed in the process. A fine balance between aggression and survival. Sarah looked through her rifle scope at the nearest checkpoint. She could see 4 fighters sitting around a small fire, their weapons leaning against rocks nearby. Sloppy discipline. But these men probably thought they were far from any real threat. They were about to learn otherwise. She waited until she saw the general begin his descent toward the valley in the distance, a dark shape moving carefully down the slope. Once he was committed to the crossing, she would begin. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, her breathing slow and controlled. The cold mountain air bit at her exposed skin, but she barely noticed. All her focus was on the task ahead. The general disappeared into the shadows of the valley. It was time. Sarah's first shot took one of the fighters at the checkpoint through the chest before the sound of the rifle even registered with his companions. Her second shot dropped another fighter as he stood up in confusion. The remaining 2 scrambled for their weapons, but Sarah's third and fourth shots found them before they could return fire. For down in less than 6 seconds. She immediately shifted her aim to the second checkpoint, farther down the ridge. The fighters there had heard the shots and were taking cover, but they had not yet located her position. Sarah fired rapidly, not aiming for kills now, but for suppression, forcing them to keep their heads down and preventing them from organizing a response. Shouts erupted across the mountainside as Red Scorpion fighters poured out of their shelters and bunkers. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as they began firing wildly in all directions, not yet sure where the attack was coming from. Sarah's plan was working. They were focused on her, completely distracted from the general's escape route. She pulled the pin on her grenade and threw it toward a cluster of fighters attempting to advance on her position. The explosion sent bodies flying and created panic among the remaining militants. Sarah used the confusion to fire more controlled shots, dropping anyone who tried to organize a counterattack. Her rifle ran dry and she smoothly transitioned to a fresh magazine, never stopping her rate of fire. Return fire was intensifying now. The Red Scorpions had located her muzzle flashes and were concentrating their fire on her position. Bullets whined off the rocks around her, sending stone chips flying. One round struck the rock inches from her head, the impact stunning her momentarily. But She recovered and continued firing, determined to keep their attention. She saw movement in her peripheral vision. A group of fighters was trying to flank her position, working their way up the ridge to her left. Sarah engaged them with precise shots, forcing them to take cover. But more fighters were coming, and she was running low on ammunition. Time to move. Sarah fired her last few rounds from her current position, then rolled backward into the crevice she had identified earlier. Bullets struck the spot where she had been lying moments before. She scrambled down the narrow gap between rocks, sliding and climbing in equal measure. Behind her, she could hear the red scorpions reaching her former position, shouting when they found it empty. She emerged from the crevice about 50 meters down the backside of the ridge. Without pausing, she ran along a narrow goat trail that followed the contour of the mountain. The red scorpions would be pursuing, trying to cut off her escape routes. She had to keep moving, keep them chasing her, and away from the general. The trail led down into a boulder field where massive rocks created a maze of passages and dead ends. Sarah plunged into it, using her smaller size to squeeze through gaps that would slow her larger pursuers. She could hear them crashing through the rocks behind her, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like searching fingers. Sarah paused behind a large boulder to catch her breath and assess the situation. She checked the valley where the general should be crossing. In the darkness, she thought she saw a signal, 3 brief flashes of light. The emergency beacon. The general had made it across the border and was calling for extraction. Relief flooded through her. The primary mission was accomplished. The general was safe. Now she just had to survive long enough to reach the extraction point herself. The red scorpions were close, too close. Sarah could hear them on all sides, systematically searching the boulder field. She was surrounded with nowhere to run. Her ammunition was nearly exhausted, just a few rounds in her pistol. Fighting her way out was not an option. Then, she remembered something from her training. Sometimes the best hiding place was not far away from your enemies, but close to them. She climbed up onto a large, flat-topped boulder and lay completely flat, using the darkness and the boulder's height to conceal her. Red scorpion fighters passed directly beneath her, so close she could hear their breathing and smell their cigarette smoke. They never thought to look up. She remained frozen in place for over an hour as the search continued around her. Fighters came and went, frustrated by their inability to find her. Eventually, their leader called them back, deciding that pursuing a single soldier through treacherous terrain in darkness was too dangerous. They would wait for daylight and bring in tracking dogs. Sarah waited until she was certain they had withdrawn, then carefully climbed down from her perch. Her body was stiff from lying motionless on the cold rock, and every muscle protested as she moved. But she was alive and free, at least for now. Dawn was still several hours away. If she moved quickly, she could reach the border before the red scorpions resumed their search. She navigated by the stars, moving as silently as a ghost through the darkness. The terrain was treacherous, and several times she nearly fell or walked off unseen cliffs. But her training and determination kept her moving forward. The border was close now, maybe 2 kilometers. So close she could almost taste the safety that lay beyond. An hour before dawn, Sarah crossed the invisible line that marked the border. Officially, she was now in friendly territory, though the red scorpions would not respect such legal distinctions if they caught her. She kept moving, heading toward the extraction point coordinates the general had been given. She found him in a small clearing, surrounded by soldiers from the extraction team. A helicopter sat nearby, its rotors slowly spinning as it prepared to take off. When the general saw Sarah emerge from the tree line, exhausted and bloody but alive, his face broke into a huge smile. He had been certain she would not make it. The extraction team commander immediately tried to get Sarah onto the helicopter, but she insisted on a quick perimeter check first. Years of training made it impossible for her to relax until she was absolutely certain they were secure. Only when she was satisfied that no threats were near did she allow herself to climb aboard the aircraft. As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah looked back at the mountains of Karathos disappearing behind them. The red scorpions would be furious at losing their prized prisoner and humiliated that a single soldier had infiltrated their fortress and escaped with him. But that was no longer her concern. The mission was complete. General Brennan sat beside her in the helicopter, insisting that the medic treat Sarah's injuries before his own. She had a deep gash on her shoulder from the bullet graze, her hands were shredded, and she had numerous cuts and bruises. But none of it was life-threatening. She would heal. The flight to the forward operating base took 40 minutes. When they landed, a crowd of soldiers and officers was waiting. Word of the successful rescue had already spread. As Sarah stepped off the helicopter, barely able to stand from exhaustion, the assembled soldiers began to applaud. She was uncomfortable with the attention, but the general placed his hand on her shoulder and told her to accept it. She had earned it. Colonel Hayes was there, his face showing relief and pride in equal measure. He had sent her on what he believed was likely a suicide mission, and she had not only survived but succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. He saluted her crisply, and she returned the salute despite her injuries. The general was taken immediately to the medical facility for a full examination and treatment. Sarah was supposed to go as well, but she first had to debrief the intelligence officers about everything she had observed in enemy territory. She spent 2 hours describing the fortress layout, the Red Scorpion positions, their tactics, and equipment, anything that might be useful for future operations. Only then was she allowed to seek medical attention. A doctor cleaned and stitched her wounds, wrapped her damaged hands, and gave her antibiotics to prevent infection. He wanted to keep her in the hospital for observation, but Sarah refused. All she wanted was a shower, food, and sleep. The doctor reluctantly agreed, making her promise to return if she developed any fever or if her wounds showed signs of infection. Sarah returned to her quarters and stood under the hot water of the shower for nearly an hour, washing away days of sweat, blood, and fear. She watched the water run red as it cleaned her wounds, then gradually clear as the worst of the dirt and dried blood spiraled down the drain. When she finally emerged, she felt almost human again. She ate mechanically, her body demanding fuel even though she had no appetite. Then, she collapsed onto her bed, not bothering to turn off the lights or get under the covers. Sleep took her instantly, deep and dreamless, the sleep of absolute exhaustion. She woke 16 hours later to find Colonel Hayes sitting in a chair beside her bed. He had been waiting for her to wake up, unwilling to disturb the rest she so desperately needed. He told her that General Brennan was recovering well and had already spoken to the military command about her actions. He also told her that her mission had been classified at the highest levels. Very few people would ever know what she had done. Sarah asked about the Red Scorpions. The colonel explained that the successful rescue and the intelligence she had provided had allowed a larger operation to be planned. Within 72 hours, a joint military task force had raided the fortress and several other Red Scorpion positions. Viktor Kozlov, the group's leader, had been killed in the fighting. The organization was effectively destroyed as a military threat. Sarah felt a grim satisfaction at this news. The Red Scorpions would not be kidnapping anyone else or terrorizing the region. The risks she had taken, the fears she had overcome, had been worth it in the end. The colonel then told her she was being recommended for the highest military honors, though the ceremony itself would be private given the classified nature of the operation. Sarah said she did not need recognition. She had done her duty, nothing more. But the colonel insisted that what she had accomplished went far beyond duty. She had displayed courage, skill, and determination that set a new standard for special operations. Over the following days, Sarah's injuries slowly healed. She spent time with the general, who had recovered remarkably well given his ordeal. He told her stories from his long military career and spoke about his family, who had been terrified when he was kidnapped and overjoyed at his rescue. He made Sarah promise to visit them once they were all back home. Eventually, Sarah was cleared to return to regular duty, though she was given the option of extended leave if she wanted it. She chose to return to work immediately. Sitting idle would only give her time to dwell on everything that had happened, and she preferred to stay busy. The mission had changed her in ways she was still processing. She had always been confident in her training and abilities, but facing such overwhelming odds and surviving had given her a new understanding of what she was truly capable of. She had looked death in the face repeatedly and each time found a way to keep going. She also carried the weight of the lives she had taken during the mission. The guards outside the general's cell, the fighters she had killed during the escape, the men caught in her grenade blast. They had been her enemies, combatants who would have killed her without hesitation, but they were still human beings. Sarah did not regret her actions, as they had been necessary for the mission's success, but she would remember every face and carry the burden of those deaths. Several weeks later, Sarah received orders to report to a secure briefing room. When she arrived, she found General Brennan waiting along with several high-ranking officers she did not recognize. They told her about a new special operations unit being formed, one designed to handle the most dangerous and sensitive missions. They wanted her to be part of it, to use her unique skills and experience to train others and lead future operations. Sarah considered the offer carefully. It would mean more danger, more impossible missions, more nights wondering if she would see the sunrise. But it would also mean the opportunity to make a real difference, to use her abilities to protect others and serve her country at the highest level. She thought about the general, about how many lives his strategic brilliance had saved over the years. She thought about how close he had come to dying in that fortress, and how many others might face similar fates without someone willing to risk everything to save them. She accepted the position. Years later, when people asked General Brennan about his kidnapping and rescue, he would always tell the same story. How a single soldier, a captain named Sarah Mitchell, had infiltrated enemy territory alone, freed him from an impregnable fortress, evaded dozens of pursuers through hostile jungle and mountains, and brought him safely home against impossible odds. He would describe her courage, her skill, her unwavering determination in the face of overwhelming danger. And he would always end the story the same way, by saying that Captain Sarah Mitchell had taught him the true meaning of the word hero. Not someone who never felt fear, but someone who felt fear and acted anyway. Not someone who never doubted, but someone who pushed through doubt to do what needed to be done. Not someone who sought glory or recognition, but someone who simply did their duty to the absolute best of their ability, regardless of the cost. Sarah herself rarely spoke about the mission. When pressed, she would say she had simply done her job, that any soldier with her training would have done the same. But those who knew her understood the truth. What she had accomplished that week in the mountains of Karathos was extraordinary by any measure. A solo rescue mission that defied all odds and succeeded through a combination of exceptional skill, careful planning, and sheer determination. The classified reports of her mission were stored in secure archives, marked so that only those with the highest security clearances could access them. But among the special operations community, the story was told and retold, though never with names or specific details. It became a legend, a story of what was possible when a properly trained soldier was willing to risk everything for a mission they believed in. Sarah went on to serve for many more years, participating in operations that would never be publicly acknowledged, training new generations of special operators in the skills that had saved her life in Karathos. She received numerous decorations and commendations, though most were classified and would never appear on her public service record. But if asked what she was most proud of in her entire career, she would always point to that solo mission behind enemy lines. Not because it was the most difficult thing she had ever done, though it certainly was. Not because it earned her recognition, though the general had made sure the right people knew what she had accomplished. But because she had set out to bring a good man home safely. And despite every obstacle, every danger, every moment when success seemed impossible, she had succeeded. General Brennan had been worth saving, and Captain Sarah Mitchell had been exactly the right person to save him. In the end, that was all that mattered. Left to breathe normally. That had been far too close. The general looked at her with new respect, impressed by her quick thinking and her perfect command of the local language. Sarah just nodded and got them moving again, not wanting to waste the opportunity the deception had bought them. They climbed higher into the mountains as the day progressed. The air grew thinner and colder. Snow appeared on the ground in shaded areas, and ice made the rocks treacherous. The general was struggling badly now. His breathing labored in the thin air, his legs barely able to carry him. Sarah supported him, essentially dragging him up the increasingly steep slopes. By late afternoon, they reached the pass. Sarah could see the border from here, a line on her map rather than anything visible on the ground. Beyond that line was safety, but they still had to cross several kilometers of open terrain to reach the extraction point. And between them and safety, she could see Red Scorpion positions. The militants had set up checkpoints and observation posts covering all the obvious routes across the border. Sarah found a sheltered spot among the rocks and laid out her plan. They would wait for full darkness, then make their move. She had one idea, risky but possible. The extraction point was in a valley on the other side of the border. If she could use her emergency beacon to signal the extraction team, while simultaneously creating a distraction to draw the Red Scorpions away from the border, they might have a chance to slip through. The general asked what kind of distraction. Sarah pulled out her last grenade and her remaining ammunition. She would set up a position away from their actual crossing point and open fire on the Red Scorpion positions. The militants would respond to the attack, converging on her position. While they were focused on her, the general would cross the border and reach the extraction point. The general immediately objected. He would not allow Sarah to sacrifice herself. Sarah explained it was not a sacrifice, just tactics. Once she drew the Red Scorpions away, she would use the terrain to break contact and escape. She was trained for this, she was fast, and she knew how to evade pursuit. It was their best chance, possibly their only chance. They argued about it as darkness fell, but Sarah was adamant. Finally, the general relented, recognizing the logic even if he did not like it. Sarah gave him the emergency beacon and showed him how to activate it. Once he was safely across the border, he should activate it and wait for extraction. The team would come for him, and, with luck, for her as well if she managed to escape the Red Scorpions. Sarah could see fighters getting out of the trucks, some of them looking around, scanning the river. She had to make a choice. Risk crossing back to help the general and possibly getting them both spotted, or stay where she was and hope he made it across in time. Before she could decide, the general's foot slipped. He grabbed at the tree trunk, managing to catch himself, but the sudden movement caught the attention of one of the fighters. The man shouted and pointed at the river. In seconds, a dozen Red Scorpions were looking directly at them. Sarah opened fire, her rifle barking as she laid down covering fire. She hit two fighters before they could bring their own weapons to bear, forcing the others to dive for cover. She screamed at the general to move, to get across the river now. The general scrambled forward, abandoning caution for speed as bullets began striking the water around him and chewing into the tree trunk. They crashed onto the rocky outcrop, the general crying out in pain. The severed rope fell away into the darkness. Sarah assessed their situation quickly. They were trapped on a ledge barely 2 meters wide, with no rope, and still 50 meters above the valley floor. Above them, the Red Scorpions were celebrating, thinking their prisoners had fallen to their deaths. But Sarah had not survived this long by giving up. She examined the cliff face carefully, using her flashlight sparingly. There were handholds and cracks in the rock. Difficult, but climbable. She explained to the general that they would have to free climb down, something he had never done before. The general looked at the drop below them and then at Sarah. He told her to leave him, to save herself. Sarah refused flatly. She had not come all this way to abandon him now. She would get him down this cliff or die trying. She positioned the general and taught him the basics of climbing in whispered instructions. Hand here, foot there, test each hold before trusting your weight to it. Then, she began descending, guiding him through each movement. Progress was agonizingly slow. Several times the general's grip slipped, and Sarah had to brace herself to stop his fall. Her shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed it, and her fingers were bleeding from gripping the sharp rock. And changing back into her tactical clothing once she was safely in the jungle. She studied her maps, trying to identify which mountain might house this fortress. There were several possibilities, but one stood out. An old military installation built during the Civil War, supposedly abandoned. It was marked on the map, but dismissed in the intelligence reports as uninhabitable. Sarah adjusted her course, heading toward the mountain. The terrain grew even more challenging as she climbed higher. The jungle gave way to rocky slopes and narrow paths. She had to use her climbing gear several times to navigate particularly steep sections. The temperature dropped as altitude increased, and mist rolled in, reducing visibility. Late in the afternoon, she found what she was looking for. Through the mist, she could see the dark outline of stone walls built into the mountainside. The fortress. It was larger than she expected, a sprawling complex that took advantage of the natural rock formations. She could see guards posted at various points, and smoke rising from several locations inside the walls. Sarah found a concealed observation post about 500 meters from the fortress. Using her scope, she studied the layout carefully. The main gate faced south, heavily guarded. There were watchtowers at each corner, manned constantly. The walls were high and looked solid despite their age. This was going to be extremely difficult. She counted at least 20 Red Scorpion fighters visible, which meant there were probably twice that many inside. She needed to locate General Brennan within that fortress, determine the best approach for extraction, and figure out how to get both of them out alive. And she needed to do it all without being discovered. As darkness fell, Sarah settled in for a long night of observation. This was the most critical phase of the mission. Every detail mattered. Every guard rotation, every weak point in the defenses, every possible escape route. She had one chance to get this right. Failure meant death for both her and the general.